This is the Thypoch Simera 35 f1.4 for the Leica M mount. It is very similar in size and obviously specifications to the Leica Summilux, which I recently picked up. But how well does it actually perform in comparison to this incredibly expensive lens? Let's find out. So Thypoch did send this out for the sake of this review, but it's not paid. I'm not sending them this video before they're seeing it, but all of these thoughts are definitely my own. So right off the bat, I'm also going to compare this to the Zeiss, which I have, but I'm letting a friend borrow it right now, so I don't have it on the table. I have shot some comparison images though, so we'll have a good idea of what's happening. But as you can see, hopefully in this overhead shot, the size and weight and things like that of these two lenses are very, very similar. So this is the first version of the Leica Summilux spherical FLE, basically version 1. I just took the lens hood off, so it is more similar in look, I guess, to the Thypoch Simera here. Both of them, as you can see, pass the Leica balance test, as I call it. So they definitely don't fall forward because they are too front heavy. They both are f1.4 apertures. The Thypoch Simera here does have a close focus setting. So where the Voigtlanders I've been critical about them not having this. Once you get to 0.7, you have a little detent here, and then you can push it just a little bit further to go to 0.45 meters. So the Leica stops at 0.7. This then hits the 0.7 and will also allow you to go a little bit further. But if you're using the rangefinder only, you definitely know exactly when you're hitting that point, making this a very useful lens if you want to use the close focus system here. Now, the styling here is really, really interesting. They obviously have gone with a different kind of font. It is very reminiscent overall of kind of like a vintage Leica lens without it being overly like copying. So they're not using the same typeface. They're not using the same coloring, things like that, which is something I do really appreciate because when you have a lens that's obviously going towards another lens, I'm trying to sort of replicate the look and the feel and the image quality of a Summilux, sure, but I'm not trying to get like a fake one that has the same fonts and everything just within a different optical formula. Definitely something that I appreciate about this lens is that they have designed it in a way that looks good on a Leica camera, but isn't overly trying to be a Leica when it's not, if that makes sense. One of the things that's a little bit unique about it as well is it has this infinity lock. It's something honestly that I'm not that big of a fan of. It's something that is a little bit of annoyance, and maybe it's something that I need to get used to, but to get it out of infinity lock, you have to press the button in and then push it over. So it's probably something that muscle memory will help. But as far as a focusing tab goes, it is pretty nice. I find myself kind of pinching it to focus, which is definitely interesting. So it's more similar to the Zeiss that has like a little bump there instead of the Leica that has a little, I guess like crescent moon shape of sorts, where you stick your finger in there to get your focus. So when I'm focusing, I have my finger inside of this with thing on each side, and I'm typically focusing with one finger. And with the Thypoch Simera, I'm typically not focusing with one finger like this. I'm typically kind of holding it with two fingers. So kind of an interesting ergonomic difference, but you can see there too, I got to the infinity lock and I then have to move my fingers to undo that infinity lock. So kind of an interesting thing. It's not my favorite, but of the designs, I'm glad that we have some sort of focus tab to make it a little bit easier. Another really interesting thing here is the way that they go about doing your like hyperfocal distance scale. You have this whole setup where you have these little dots. I'm sure you've seen them in other videos if you are familiar with this lens at all. But as you stop down these little dots, the dots will change as you go up and down the scale here to kind of show you. It's a really, really interesting design, and it's something that, I don't know, it looks pretty cool. It's pretty interesting and unique. The only thing that throws me off about it a little bit is the fact that there's just literal holes in the lens right there. So I would be a little bit worried about moisture and things getting inside of the lens, even dust, things like that. I'm not sure what else is happening. I haven't taken the lens apart to figure that out, but it is something that, as I was trying to think critically about this lens, could be slightly concerning. Now, in terms of image quality, I was very surprised at how well this thing performed. It is definitely pretty sharp. It's not overly sharp. It's definitely out of the three 35 1.4 lenses that I have. It is the least sharp behind the Zeiss that is the sharpest, the Leica that is the second sharpest, and then the Thypoch Simera here. But this lens coming in at well under $1,000. I'm not necessarily at 1.4 thinking that I'm going to get Leica or Zeiss sharpness out of this, I guess. Kind of a weird pairing, but I found that especially for a lower megapixel camera, especially for film, the sharpness would be more than enough for sure. On a 60 megapixel sensor like the Leica M11 here, you can definitely zoom in and see the softness, but I would not say that sharpness necessarily is an issue that I would be not buying this lens for, if that makes sense. Now, the area where this does suffer the most, I would say, is chromatic aberration. It doesn't have a typical like magenta to green chromatic aberration as many other classic lenses do. It kind of has a slightly more like bluish to orangish chromatic aberration. So that it definitely does suffer from. And it's one of those things that cleaning up in post is a bit annoying. It's not the worst thing in the world for sure, but it is something to look out for if that's something that really bothers you. But overall, this lens is fantastic, and I've been very, very impressed by its look and style. So now knowing all that information, I figured I would use both that information and my expertise of sorts in knowing how the Summilux performs as well as the Zeiss, and do a little breakdown, basically just kind of rating all three 1 through 10 and giving it an artificial score of sorts, but at least you can get my feeling of where each lens kind of sits, and then we can see which one kind of scores the highest in this little thing. Let me know if you find this useful or not. So I'm going to rank all of these things 1 through 10. We have size, the feel, the build quality, the sharpness, chromatic aberration performance, the character, and then the price, which for many people is going to be a massive deciding factor, as it is for me anytime I buy anything. So in terms of size, the Thypoch and the Summilux here are very, very similar. I would say the Summilux is just ever so slightly smaller. So I'm going to give the Leica a 10 in terms of size. I'm going to give the Thypoch a 9.5. And then the Zeiss, if you've ever listened to me talk about that, is maybe the best lens for the money, but the size is the largest deterrent by far, large being the considerable word here. So I'm giving the Zeiss a 2 in that regard. The feel, I do really love the feel of the Leica. I like the manual focusing tab the best on that. The Thypoch gets a very similar thing. I find the aperture ring to be very clicky, very helpful there. The infinity lock is a preference thing, so I'm not going to deduct it necessarily. So we'll give the Thypoch like an 8.5 out of feel. And the Zeiss, we are going to give a 9 out of feel because it is really good ergonomically and things like that. It's just not fully to where I personally like things on Leica quality, but again, all of them are very good in terms of that. The build quality, I think that the Thypoch does really, really well. I haven't seen any issues in tolerance or anything like that. So I'm going to give all of these a 9 because they all are very fantastic. Now, the Thypoch, again, is very sharp, but it's not like clinically sharp, especially on a 60 megapixel sensor. So we're going to give it an 8. The Zeiss, if I could give it higher than a 10, I would, because it is very sharp. So we'll give it a 10. And then just to be fair, we'll give the Leica a 9. So they all kind of fit in that upper level range for sure. Now, chromatic aberration, this is probably where the Thypoch falls the shortest. I would say it is pretty bad. So I'm going to give it a 5. The Zeiss is actually pretty good. We're going to give it an 8. It's not, none of these lenses, to my knowledge, are apochromatic, so they're all going to suffer from that. And then the Leica, we'll give it like a 7.5 because it's not perfect, but it's usable. As far as character goes, they're all pretty similar. I will give the Leica a 9, the Zeiss a 8, and let's give the Thypoch an 8 as well. And now here is where there's also going to be a giant discrepancy. The Leica is just stupid expensive, obviously. Even at the price that I paid, which was just a little bit less than $3,000, That's a lot of money. So we will give the Leica a price of 3. We'll give the Thypoch a price of 10 because it definitely wins the price battle here. And then I'll give the Zeiss like a 7 because it does really well, but it's still, I think the MSRP here is $2,200, something like that. So it's not cheap, but for its performance, it's incredible. So our totals here, and we'll definitely fast forward through this because we do not need to have me adding up all this stuff. So if we are going off of the scoreboard that I made here, the Thypoch actually scores the highest at 58. The Zeiss scores the lowest at 53, and the Leica scores the second highest, just barely behind the Thypoch at 57.5. So honestly, kind of like where it stands, the biggest things for each of these being that if you want the best price to performance ratio and all of that kind of stuff, the Thypoch is going to be the winner for sure. It just absolutely slayed in the price category, which made a big difference. If you have the money to spend and image quality is your highest priority, the Zeiss is definitely going to be the best. It is the best performer overall in terms of image quality, and it is kind of in the mid-range in terms of price. So if you want the best price to performance ratio and you don't care as much about the ergonomics, then obviously the Zeiss is going to be your winner. And then if you have the money to spend, if you are like a purist of sorts, if you want just the best feel, build quality, all that kind of stuff, and the best mid-range performance, and by mid-range, I mean in between these three things, it's not the sharpest, but it is definitely sharp. It has a really good look and feel. The character is great, all those kinds of things. Go with the Leica. If you're interested in any of these lenses, I'll put the links in the description down below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and then you can check out one of these videos to learn more about all of my thoughts on Leica stuff.